Why did Putin invade Ukraine? Why is Russia at war with the West? Doesn't Russia know the Cold War is over? Why is Putin challenging the power of the United States, knowing it can never truly match its strength? These are questions that have flooded headlines and dominated discussions. Yet the answers are complex, rooted in history, ideology, and Russia's deep desire to reclaim its lost power. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. It wasn't just an economic failure, it was a total strategic defeat. While economic mismanagement and military overreach played a role, the real lesson wasn't the fall of communism itself. It was the realization that no state, no ideology, no rival could match the sheer power of the United States. This moment was summed up in Francis Fukuyama's famous concept, the end of history. The idea that liberal democracy had triumphed and no alternative system could realistically challenge it. America had reached an unprecedented level of global dominance, not just militarily, but politically and culturally. It set the rules and the world followed. Russia, once a superpower, was now a broken state, left to play by Washington's rules. Then came Boris Yeltsin's era, a decade of chaos. Russia's economy crumbled. The country became an oligarch's playground. Former Soviet elites and businessmen scrambled to seize industries, while corruption ran unchecked. The state was weak, and the West no longer saw Russia as a serious threat. As Russia fell deeper into dysfunction, wars erupted within its own borders. The First Chechen War, 1994 to 1996, exposed the Russian military's incompetence. What was supposed to be a swift crackdown turned into a brutal, drawn-out conflict that ended in failure. Russia, once feared, now looked powerless on the world stage. Then came the Second Chechen War, 1999 to 2000. This time, Vladimir Putin, a relatively unknown politician, took charge. He waged the war with brutality and precision, crushing Chechen resistance and restoring order. This victory made Putin wildly popular, launching his rise to power. But beneath the surface, the lesson was clear. Russia had won a war within its own borders, but it was still too weak to project power globally. The era of competing head-to-head with the US was over. If Russia wanted to be relevant again, it needed a different approach. When Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, Russia was still economically weak, politically unstable, and militarily inferior to the United States and NATO. Putin recognized that Russia could not challenge the West through direct competition. Not in military power, economic influence, or global alliances. Instead, he pursued a new strategy. Rather than confronting the West head-on, Russia would seek indirect influence, economic leverage, regional conflicts, cyber operations, political destabilization. These would be the new weapons of Russian power. The first step, energy dominance. Throughout the 2000s, Russia established itself as Europe's primary energy supplier. Russian energy giants like Gazprom controlled the flow of natural gas to the European Union, especially Germany, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. In 2006 and 2009, Russia cut off gas supplies to Ukraine, demonstrating how it could use energy as a political weapon. Meanwhile, at home, Putin consolidated power. The early 2000s saw him dismantle the influence of independent oligarchs and replace them with loyalists. The Yukos affair, 2003 to 2005, was a turning point. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, once Russia's wealthiest businessman, was arrested and his oil company seized. The message was clear: economic power was now under the Kremlin's control. This marked the beginning of Putinism. a system where business and politics became one, ensuring absolute loyalty to the state. Are these methods effective? No. Is this the way to regain influence and make Russia great again? No. But why does Russia persist? This is something rarely acknowledged in the Western world. Russia, for all intents and purposes, is a fallen superpower. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just a geopolitical shift, it was an identity crisis. Putinism, the ideology that emerged from this crisis, is built on one goal: restoring Russia's greatness, no matter the cost. In this, Russia's trajectory resembles that of Germany after World War I. Like post-Versailles Germany, Russia found itself humiliated, economically weakened, and politically unstable. Both nations saw the rise of a leader who channeled resentment into a nationalistic revival. Both rejected the New World Order imposed by their former enemies. Both sought to reclaim lost territories, Germany with the Rhineland and Sudetenland, Russia with Crimea and Ukraine. And both convinced themselves that they were destined for a glorious return. But here the parallel ends. Putin is not Hitler, and Russia is not a fascist state. Unlike Nazi Germany, which was driven by racial ideology, Russia's nationalism is not racial but historical. It is not about superiority over others, it is about redemption. The Russian state does not seek to eradicate lesser peoples, but to prove to itself that it still belongs among the great powers. Yet, like all who refuse to accept their limitations, Russia remains blind to the weaknesses that make this dream an illusion. The ideology of Putinism, as it has come to be known, is rooted in a belief in Russian exceptionalism. It is a worldview that views Russia not as a country of the present, but as the heir to a glorious past, a past defined by the power of the Tsars and the Soviet Union. Putinism rejects the notion of liberal democracy and the Western-centric international order, instead embracing nationalism, state power, and a return to Russia's former greatness. This ideology is deeply intertwined with the notion of historical justice. For Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, a tragedy that must be undone in order to restore Russia's rightful place in the world. This vision is informed by a deep sense of national pride, but also by a profound sense of grievance. Russia's actions in Ukraine, as well as its increasingly confrontational stance toward the West, are fueled by this desire to reclaim lost territory and to push back against what Russia perceives as a Western-led global order that has marginalized it. The idea of sovereign democracy, as Putin has termed it, is central to this vision. Unlike Western liberal democracy, which is based on free elections and individual rights, sovereign democracy places the state at the center, with the leader as the guarantor of national unity and strength. In Putin's view, Russia is too unique, too special to conform to Western models of governance. While some compare Putin to historical figures like Stalin or even Hitler, it is important to recognize that Putinism is not simply a revival of totalitarianism or fascism. It is, in many ways, a form of nationalism that seeks to reconcile Russia's troubled history with its aspirations for the future. Russia's actions in Ukraine, though aggressive and expansionist, are not driven by racial hatred or ideological fanaticism, but by a deeply held belief in the need to restore Russia's place as a global power. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was never a strategically sound decision. Even the Kremlin must have known this. Militarily, Russia was not prepared for a full-scale conquest, and it certainly lacked the strength to occupy the entirety of Ukraine. The Russian leadership, despite its propaganda, is not blind to its own limitations. And yet the war happened. Why? Because the ideological drive behind the invasion was not rational, it was existential. A powerful force, but not a smart one. On paper, the war makes no economic sense. Russia has suffered enormous losses both in manpower and in resources. The Western sanctions have crippled its economy, cutting it off from crucial global markets. Even in a mini-strategic sense, the war has been a disaster. NATO, instead of weakening, has expanded. Europe, instead of dividing, has united against Russia. The war has not increased Russia's power, it has exposed its weaknesses. But for the Russian people and for the Kremlin's vision of Russia, the war makes perfect sense. In 2021, December 26th, marked the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union, an event that shattered Russian pride and identity. In the eyes of the Kremlin, to do nothing in the face of this anniversary would have been to acknowledge Russia's decline. And if Russia does not act, if it does not force the world to remember its presence, then it will fade into irrelevance. It will become a forgotten empire, swallowed by China, or reduced once more to the shadow of Western influence. This is not an acceptable future. So 2 months later, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. For many Russians, the choice is stark: to die in an eternal war with the West or to accept oblivion. They choose war, not because they believe in victory, but because they refuse to fade away. The invasion of Ukraine, then, is not about winning. It is about refusing to lose. Russia does not need to conquer Ukraine. It simply needs to fight. The war itself is the statement. It is the act of defiance that keeps Russia relevant, that keeps the illusion of power alive. In this way, Putinism has turned war into a permanent condition, a tool not just for geopolitics but for national survival. But how long can this last? The answer lies not in Russia's military strength nor in the will of the West, but in the Russian people themselves. How long can they endure? How long can they sustain a war that serves only as a desperate attempt to hold on to an empire that no longer exists? None of this justifies what Putin is doing to the people of Ukraine, but by dehumanizing Russians, we ensure that we never reach a true understanding of Russia's aggression. Every time I mentioned Russian people, I meant Russian people with the voice to vote and power to back it up, not the majority of the people. The real Russian people must choose, not between victory and defeat, but between an existence defined by power and one defined by survival. Oblivion is not the only alternative to empire. Russia does not need to be a superpower to exist. It does not even need to be a great power. It only needs to be a state, one that functions, provides for its people, and maintains its relevance not through war, but through stability and self-preservation. Russia is a nation with 1,000 years of history. It has ruled over vast lands, shaped world events, and commanded empires. But power is never eternal. The lesson of history is that no empire lasts forever, and the Russian people must come to terms with this truth. Yet this is not a lesson that can be forced upon them. It is a realization they must reach on their own. The West cannot impose it, but it must allow it to happen. To push Russia into a corner, to deny it a future beyond war and decline, is to risk something far worse. For all its weaknesses, Russia remains a nuclear power. A nation that sees no future beyond war is a nation that may choose destruction over irrelevance. And that is a risk the Russian people and the world cannot afford. At some point, this madness must end. It won't happen through conquest, but through compromise. History has ended, but the story of humanity is still being written. But the ending, that's for the humanity to decide. Thanks for watching. I will see you all in the next one.